Okay, just a quick follow-up video on the terminal overshoot video I made yesterday about Professor William Reese's research that was inspired originally by the book Overshoot by William Catton, published in 1982. And I studied that book about 10 years later for my environmental conservation class at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so I was reading one of the recent papers by Professor William Reese, called putting a camel through the eye of a needle, and that was the metaphor he was using for what civilization's facing now for what he calls terminal overshoot, in terms of going past the carrying capacity of natural resources for supporting the economy. And there's one figure that stood out to me. He cites a 2003 paper stating that in 1997, the carbon emissions from the use of coal and oil was the equivalent of 422 times the net primary production of photosynthesis on Earth in one year. So at first I didn't understand this figure, but so I looked up the original study, and what he was referring to is that phytoplankton is the main source of coal and oil. It's like 86% from algae in the oceans. And even though algae in the blue light is like 100% energy transfer from photons to electron energy, it then has to use that to create carbohydrates and proteins and whatever. So it's about the same as plants on Earth, where it's like 40 to 50% carbon. But that process takes a certain amount of energy. And it turns out, as I looked into the figure he cited, 422, basically saying that the other figure he cited was like 1 gallon of gasoline is the equivalent of 90 tons of plant matter, which is really, like, you can't even visualize 90 tons of plant matter, but for 1 gallon of gasoline. But that's really is a stunning figure for how much energy we're using compared to photosynthesis. So William Reese is big. There was an immediate response to his paper. I think it was published in 2021, and there was a bunch of scientists, because he was basically saying renewable energy, there's no way it can address the energy use from fossil fuels. And I guess calling it fossil fuels is a bit, because people think it's from dinosaurs, but it's from algae. So then there was a recent study a few years ago, I think it was like 5 years ago, where they did a new look at the algae, and they discovered actually it's storing twice as much carbon as they previously thought. So then I went back to the 422 times claim, and I figured, okay, so if it's twice as much carbon sequestration rate, that would bring it down to 200, like 210 times the annual carbon sequestration by photosynthesis as net primary production. Which kind of makes sense, because William Reese is saying every year we use 1.75 Earth's amount of net primary production, which is basically the biomass that's created by life on Earth, that's stored up every year. And so this paper in 2003 was saying, well, if you convert biomass directly into fuel, you get about a 10% conversion rate compared to um, algae originally storing up carbon sequestration, which originally was like it's like 1,000th of a percent of in terms of photosynthesis turned into um, carbon, stored carbon. But since it's twice as much, I think it would be like 1/100th of a percent. So at any rate, so if we're burning, we're using up 200 times. Oh, this was 1997 too. So that means he's pointing out, well, William Rees is pointing out, well, we've increased our energy use by 40% since 1997. So that would bring you up to like 300 times about. So every year we are burning up, emitting CO2 the equivalent of 300 times a year, 300 years of photosynthesis as carbon sequestration on Earth. So then you figure, okay, well, that rate of algae sequestration was dramatically reduced when we killed off like 10 million whales. When we first used oil, we got it from whale blubber. And so we killed off almost all the whales in the oceans. And so that was like, I don't know, like 10 to 20 million whales. I can't remember the amount. But Sir David King is focused on doing deep ocean volcanic fertilization because it turns out volcanic ash has all the nutrients necessary to then grow the algae. So it would cause algae booms, which would then increase the krill population, which was today's wordle, by the way, krill. I got it easily because I was researching algae all day yesterday. And so then the krill get eaten by the fish, and then the fish or the whales, and then the whale, fertilize. They sequester the carbon by, it keeps circulating like that, but essentially the scat, the ocean scat, is what causes the carbon to then sink down and get sequestered into the depths. And so essentially what Sir David King is saying, that he thinks we could store up at least 30 gigatons of CO2 a year by doing the deep ocean fertilization. And then China, these scientists said, one of them was they're all from Guangdong, China, but one went to MIT and Harvard a few years ago, and then they published science saying that using AI, they think they can sequester 100 gigatons of CO2 per year doing algae, near ocean algae farms using photobioreactors. So when you look at algae in terms of turning it into fuel, it's not efficient at all because you're using the carbon to try to create gasoline instead of using biomass directly from like ethanol, which would be more efficient, but it's still not. It's still a loss of energy overall. When you look at the ethanol use in the U.S., you're still using more CO2 energy, or you're emitting more CO2 than you're sequestering or whatever. But the whole point is to sequester the CO2 and not to turn it into biofuels. So William Rees, he's emphasizing that the only thing that could stop biological annihilation on Earth as terminal overshoot is to just draw down civilization, to stop all population growth, and to reduce the use of energy and basically go back to manual labor and draft animals. And he even in his paper, he figures, he's like, well, look, if you look at the number of horses that we currently have and how many horses would we need, to like replace plows, go back to what we were like in the mid 1800s or something. Of course, it still takes oil to, like, his other thing was like, because the rebuttal against him was like, well, we can just have, tons of solar panels. But his point was like, well, you have to smelt the quartz into silicon, and that takes like over a ton of coal or biomass, to run the coke, whatever the furnace is or whatever it is, and to create solar panels. So anyway, he points out that before agriculture developed by humans, the percentage of mammalian vertebrates was like 99% wild vertebrates, and 1% humans. But then, due to agriculture, the percentage of humans and draft or domesticated animals as stock, as farm stock, ranch stock, is now 90. It's like something like 96 or 90. It's really crazy. It's like 93% of all mammalian vertebrates on the planet are now either humans or livestock, and then the wildlife, mammalian vertebrates have plunged down to like only 3% in population level what they were. So then if you look at overall population reduction in the past 50 years since I've been born, there's been overall like a 50% reduction of all wildlife on Earth, whether it's invertebrates or vertebrates in the ocean, or freshwater vertebrates, or terrestrial vertebrates. And so it's an average. So some of them are like maybe 40%, some of them are like 80%, so the overall average is 50% in population size. And then, so you can see how the trend is that it's leading to a extinction, mass extinction of species crisis. And the main cause is like deforestation, but of course like overfishing. But then, so it's not just global warming, but it's part of like toxic waste and plastic pollution, and so the problem is like, even if you have this huge renewable energy increase, it actually heats up Earth faster because of the aerosol masking effect. And then they've been looking at studies. They found that like algae also has an aerosol masking effect because it releases this, I think it's called DSMO, and it's like a sulfur type particle that then is basically similar to like from diesel pollution or coal pollution, having sulfur particles that then create clouds that reflect the sunlight. And so because the over 90% of the global warming heat has gone into the oceans, you have over 500 zetajoules of extra heat that's accumulated since 1995 in the oceans. And this is the focus of Jim Massa, the oceanographer, who has a great YouTube channel, Science Talks with Jim Massa. And so the Arctic ice is at a record low. It was below its 2017 record low, so it's gone back to what it was. And because of all the ocean heat melting the ice from underneath. And so the problem is that there's the world's largest ocean shelf is in the Arctic, and it has 1,200 gigatons of pressurized methane that's preformed and ready to have a, quote, abrupt eruption. And so if you just have a 50 gigaton abrupt eruption, that would then heat up Earth another 0.6 degrees Celsius global average. But since the Arctic is heating up 4 times faster than the rest of the planet because of the loss of the albedo effect, then the methane is starting to release into the atmosphere a lot faster in the Arctic. And there's also increased fires in the tundra, which is then releasing more carbon from the permafrost. So you're getting this acceleration of CO2 and methane emissions, which is then heating up the planet faster. And so it's a positive accelerating feedback. It's an amplifying feedback. And so now we're getting it's slowing down the jet stream. So that's why we're getting more extreme weather, whether it's extreme rain or extreme drought or extreme cold, because the jet stream is what controls the weather in the bread baskets of the around the world where you're trying to grow food in the interior of the continents. And since the Arctic is like the air conditioning for the planet, when you since it's warming up 4 times faster than with the jet stream slowed down dramatically, it causes the Arctic weather to shift farther south, but then it stays put for a longer period of time. So that's why you get these extreme like storms that stick around for a longer period of time. And so then with all the ocean heat, you get stronger hurricanes. And so we have stronger tornadoes, stronger hurricanes, stronger drought, stronger what they call rain bombs or something like that. And so then you're also getting heat bombs from the equatorial, like the Mediterranean heat going up the Atlantic, or from the Pacific up in through Alaska. So they've documented these heat bombs going into the Arctic, where they're basically melting the ice from below. So yeah, that's all due to this difference in net primary production of carbon sequestration versus the burning of carbon emissions. So it's at least 300 times difference between the annual photosynthesis conversion into carbon, sequestered carbon, compared to the carbon burning that we're emitting for stored up photosynthesis energy on Earth. And that's how we've had this amazing burst of high technology as progress, and that everybody's fixated on with the cell phones and internet and whatever else, electric cars or whatever they're into, microchips and all that stuff. So there's this religion of technology where they're like, well, if we can just have better technology, it's going to save us. But when you understand that the exponential growth of the technology is actually fueled by this exponential growth of energy use. So the fastest increase of energy use right now is from AI and cryptocurrency, using these data banks for processing information. So this is even if you try to convert it to renewable energy, we're currently only have a 4% renewable energy use on Earth. So William Reese's big point is like, well, you'd have to decrease the use of fossil fuels by 50% in 5 years. You'd have to double the amount of renewable energy that it's currently using every year for 10 years. And to do that, it would require so much mining and fossil fuel increase, so that the energy use would increase by another third in order to convert to 50% renewable energy. So it's like doesn't make any sense at all, because even if you convert to renewable energy, all it does is decrease the aerosol masking effect, which is what Daniel Rosenfeld's research group documented, that the aerosol masking effect is actually twice as bad as previously thought. So that means that a 40% decrease of burning sulfur particulates actually heats up Earth another 1 degree Celsius global average, which then kicks in the abrupt eruption of methane from the Arctic, which heats up the Earth even faster. So basically, you can no longer grow food at scale in the bread baskets as the interior of the continents, because the interior of the continents are 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the global average, as Professor Guy McPherson emphasized in his excellent talks on what he calls the McPherson paradox, which is essentially this double bind of the aerosol masking effect with the methane abrupt eruption out of the Arctic, so that and the ocean heat content as the cause of the melting of the Arctic ice. So even if you if you try to increase the aerosol masking effect from above to try to decrease the heat that's melting the ice on the Arctic, it wouldn't matter. Because so there's all these schemes now where they want to do geoengineering to try to stop the melting of the Arctic. But the Arctic's melting from below, from the ocean heat, because 90% of the ocean heat is gone into the Arctic, as Jim Massa emphasizes. 90% of the, yeah, so, okay, that pretty much, my point is the future of life on Earth will be algae. So there's all these new studies looking at the effects of how the ocean heat is affecting algae growth. And because when you have increased runoff of nutrients like phosphorus pollution, and you combine that with the increase of ocean heat, does that like stop the algae from growing, or they're finding it changes the type of the algae that's grown? But the key point is, of course, to sequester the carbon from the algae growth. And so the future of life on Earth is going to be algae, one way or the other. And hopefully we can embrace the algae, which is based on this quantum negentropic energy that's non-local from the future. So it's like we're embracing the future that's the source of life on Earth, because algae's been around for 3.8 billion years. And essentially the rate of CO2 equivalent emissions right now is sending Earth back in time like 700 million years ago, at least, which is really hard to believe, but that's the equivalent of the CO2 levels, of course, but we're doing it at such a fast rate that it would then cause the cloud tipping points, which would be the burning off of the strato clouds on the oceans that are the main source of the aerosol masking effect on Earth. So when you do that, then it would really cause a spike in global temperature. And this is detailed on the Arctic News blog spot that has a little chart that shows like the worst case scenario for the clouds tipping point kicking in. And then, of course, you have all the nuclear power plants. And so there's this big fixation on, well, technology will save us. So if we just build tons of nuclear power plants, like really fast. And William Rees goes into why that would not work. And, of course, you have the problem of the radiation pollution from the uranium and tritium. And that's already happening because, of course, the corporate propaganda just covers up all the increased pollution from the tritium that's leaking out of the nuclear power plants. You can go to Nukewatch, the website Nukewatch out of Luck, Wisconsin. It's run by an activist that I got arrested with him back 30 years ago. His name's John Lafarge, and so he does great work on the real corruption in the nuclear power industry. My own dad was actually a lawyer for our state nuclear utility back when I was born, back in 1971. So I didn't know that. I got arrested at that same nuclear power utility company for my first time, again, storing nuclear waste on the Mississippi River. And that's one of the studies that John LaForge revealed, was that the tritium from the power plant that my dad helped get pushed in, having routine radiation emissions that are higher, or dangerous levels. The state wanted to have stricter standards, and the lawsuit was won by the utility to maintain the federal standards, which is basically like military intelligence. So it turns out the tritium has most likely gotten into the Mississippi water from that nuclear power plant. So whenever somebody says, "Oh, let's just have nuclear power," it's like, okay, well, why don't you go start mining uranium? Because when I was at the Pine Ridge Reservation, I was shown a creek that was polluted by uranium mining, and 2/3 of the uranium mining in the U.S. is on indigenous reservations. So obviously, when you have 2/3 of it with the miners being indigenous, then it covers up the destruction from the pollution caused by the mining. And yeah, so it's gonna be real interesting to see. Obviously, it takes a lot of carbon emissions just to build the nuclear power plants, also because you have to use so much concrete and whatever. But you can grow algae. If you grow algae, you could theoretically, I mean, you can capture all the CO2 emissions from the smelting required to build the solar panels and all the coal plants. And um, so, like I said, algae will be the future of life on Earth one way or another. So there's already been like Kentucky's done great research on capturing CO2 emissions, and also Israel has a plant that does that also um, using algae, and China's starting to do it as well. So yeah, so I have a whole video about algae um, as the solution to the abrupt global warming crisis uh, for sequestering CO2 emissions. That's on the Environmental Coffee House YouTube channel, run by Sandy. And so that's pretty much it. But as far as the terminal uh, overshoot, I mean, it's as William Rees says, we are in a super exponential growth situation, and as the exponential growth increases, um, Albert Bartlett made the great analogy of, like, if you're a bacteria in a petri dish and you're growing at a doubling rate, then right before you all die off, there's still half the petri dish is empty or full. And so you're gonna always have this debate whether the the glass of water is half empty or half full, but without the understanding that the growth rate is actually accelerating as a super exponential, what Jim Massa calls the third derivative, the jerk, as an acceleration of acceleration. So that's also called super exponential. Um, so yeah, so we're going to have increasing collapse of growing food at scale, drought, and USAID was already trying to feed like 100 million people that were facing acute food insecurity, aka famine, in Africa, because they rely on rain to grow the food. And of course, with abrupt global warming, they're having an increase in drought or flooding. But we're having the same problem in the Midwest, and they're saying, well, we can genetically engineer our crops so they can be more efficient at photosynthesis and they can survive better in drought. And so these are the kind of crazy schemes that science is trying to come up with to adapt to abrupt global warming, like the Carnegie Institute, stuff like that. And but they don't realize that the melting of the Arctic ice is way faster. So then people realize, like, even mainstream science is saying there's going to be essentially no ice in the Arctic at the minimum in September in like 5 years. But so when the problem is when that happens, then you have a much higher increase rate of the abrupt eruption of methane, pressurized methane, which then just heats up everything much faster. So the IPCC report is trying to claim that the abrupt eruption of methane is only a risk like 100 years from now. But obviously, since they underestimated the melting of the Arctic ice, and they're realizing all the other models underestimated so many other factors. And these are the positive feedback loops that the aerosol masking effect is the main one. And so this fixation on the policy of renewable energy, it doesn't address the underlying problem, which is the CO2 emissions itself. And then this causes something called terminal shock, which is something that Professor Raymond Pierre Humbert has focused on. And he just did a talk on Nick Breeze's YouTube channel, which is, you have to be a paid member to hear his talk. But I emailed with Raymond Pierre Humbert a couple times on. He's at Oxford now, but he started out at University of Chicago, and he's like the world's expert on the quantum physics origin of global warming from photon radiation as entropy. Anyway, so I'm just gonna leave it at that, and as like I said, we just keep focusing on the algae because that's algae is by far the most efficient energy transfer on Earth of photosynthesis. And then eventually that gets sequestered into carbon. But since it's like, I don't know, like at least 10 times better at photosynthesis than plants, because there's no stems or leaves with algae. It's all just pure photosynthesis.